Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping straight into a recent and honestly highly charged political broadcast. We are breaking down their analysis of a completely chaotic California debate. Whenever we look at political rhetoric, especially when it's about a massive cultural and economic powerhouse like California, things just escalate so quickly. It's like modern political debates have turned into these intense gladiatorial arenas, and that makes media analysis of them incredibly fascinating to unpack. So our goal today, we're going to step back, look really closely at how the arguments were structured in this specific national network broadcast, and figure out exactly how the commentator framed the clash of ideas on that stage. Like, what stories are they actually telling, and why are those specific rhetorical strategies hitting so hard? Let's get into it.
The broadcast we're looking at actually used this exact, visibly frustrated quote from Congresswoman Porter to set the stage for its viewers. She said, "I can't believe that on a stage with 30 minutes of interrupting and bickering and name-calling and shouting." By opening with this dramatic moment of sheer exasperation, the network wasn't just recapping the event, they were deliberately priming their audience. They used her frustration to paint this really vivid picture of a political leadership class that is just fundamentally fractured and totally in disarray. Before they even touched on a single policy issue, the broadcast strategically prepared the viewer for a deep dive into what they framed as a whole cascading series of systemic failures. To make sense of all this rapid-fire political rhetoric covered in the source material, here is our agenda. 1. Homelessness and public safety. 2. Debating voter eligibility. 3. High-speed rail costs. And 4. The California Dream legacy. All right, moving right into Section 1, Homelessness and public safety. Managing the crisis.
The commentator really structured the argument here around some incredibly severe drug crisis indicators, using them to forcefully critique current progressive policies. They didn't just talk about homelessness as like an abstract housing issue. No, they actively shifted the narrative straight toward addiction and enforcement. For instance, the broadcast leaned heavily on candidate Spencer Pratt's claim, citing the DEA, that a staggering 93% of the street crisis is actually driven by drug addiction. Specifically, we're talking about fentanyl and what they called super meth. And to really hammer this home and build this shocking mini-narrative, the commentator brought up a massive federal drug bust at MacArthur Park that happened just the day before the debate. Get this, 19 kilos of fentanyl found, some of it literally hidden in a public toilet, which led to 17 arrests. The framing here was razor sharp, basically arguing that local leadership completely failed to step in, so federal authorities had to come in and clean up the mess.
$24 billion. That is just a massive number. It's the staggering amount spent on homelessness programs in recent years. Yet, as the broadcast pointed out, state audits totally failed to measure if any of these programs actually worked. The broadcast anchored its core argument on this massive figure to highlight what they saw as a complete black hole of taxpayer money. And this is exactly where the network taps into that really visceral frustration of the electorate. They painted a picture where vast, almost incomprehensible sums of public funds just disappear into a maze of programs lacking basic oversight, all while open-air drug use remains completely rampant on the streets. It's a highly, highly effective way to frame a narrative of government incompetence.
Building on that, the broadcast highlighted another really concrete claim from candidate Spencer Pratt. He pointed out that these specific initiatives cost taxpayers over $400 million to house just 3,000 people. Now, if you actually stop and do the math on that, it's over $133,000 per person, per bed. It's wild. The commentators showcased this hyper-specific ratio to argue that progressive politicians are basically trying to spend their way out of a crisis using mathematically absurd strategies. By breaking a massive billion-dollar problem down into a per-person cost, the broadcast makes that perceived financial mismanagement feel incredibly tangible and honestly immediately frustrating for your average taxpayer. And then we get to a moment that exposed exactly how controversial harm reduction strategies have become, literally fracturing even the candidates who usually align on stage. The broadcast seized on this rapid-fire yes or no dynamic because it forced the politicians completely off their rehearsed talking points. When asked if the needle giveaway program should end, Mayor Bass surprisingly answered yes, which the commentator keenly noted was a sudden shift brought on by the scrutiny of the debate. Councilmember Raman, on the other hand, held firm with a no. Meanwhile, Spencer Pratt took the hardest line possible, saying absolutely no needles or pipes for drug addicts, period. Why does this matter? Well, the network used this exact exchange to showcase what they see as a growing ideological split within the progressive camp over how to handle the street crisis.
Okay, Section 2, Debating Voter Eligibility, a polarizing question.
The commentator focused heavily on this specific question posed by the debate moderators. Should non-citizens be allowed to vote in local elections? They used this to force the candidates to really show their political cards. Now, according to the broadcast, this is a topic that wouldn't have even been seriously considered by mainstream politicians just a few years ago. But, the Overton window has definitely shifted. Now it's become this prominent, highly debated wedge issue. By highlighting this specific question, the network effectively framed the progressive candidates as being radically out of touch with what they termed regular Americans, using the issue to draw a really hard boundary around what constitutes common sense in modern politics.
And the network absolutely loved the stark contrast here. When pressed on the voting issue, Mayor Bass and Councilmember Raman offered these evolving, nuanced answers, eventually landing on "it depends." Spencer Pratt, on the other hand, dropped a hard, unequivocal "no." The commentator actually mocked those "it depends" answers, arguing that there is zero gray area on this issue for the vast majority of voters. And let's be real, in today's soundbite era, "it depends" is often a rhetorically weak position when placed right next to absolute certainty. The broadcast used this juxtaposition to isolate the progressive candidates, basically presenting the Republican challenger's hard no as the absolute sole voice of clarity in the room.
Moving on to Section 3, High-Speed Rail Costs, the Infrastructure Debate.
The source material anchored its critique of state spending on this absolutely massive figure, the $231 billion projected cost of the California high-speed train. The commentator actively referred to this as a boondoggle and a wish list project that, in their view, should have been completely derailed years ago. In the context of the broadcast, this $231 billion price tag is way more than just a line item on a budget. It's used as a potent symbol. It represents this broader narrative of heavy regulatory burdens, endless bureaucratic delays, and wild overspending that the network claims is fundamentally driving residents and vital businesses straight out of the state.
The broadcast highlighted an incredible rhetorical mismatch here between the candidates. When asked if they would actually finish the $231 billion train, Mayor Bass and Congresswoman Porter largely defended the project, offering typical political caveats like, yes, if you can build it faster and cheaper. But the broadcast threw a massive spotlight on Sheriff Bianco's explosive response. He didn't just say no. He literally demanded that they arrest the people who stole our money. Wow, the commentator amplified Bianco's voice here because it perfectly contrasts a wonky political caveat right against a populist sledgehammer. For the network, Bianco's response brilliantly captured and symbolized the ultimate boiling point of taxpayer frustration.
Then we have candidate Becerra, who offered a quote that the commentator just gleefully characterized as a complete and total word salad. Listen to this. The slow speed delivery of high speed really, but high speed delivery of high speed rail, yes. I mean, it's confusing just to say out loud, right? The commentator seized on this jumbled delivery not just to poke fun at a verbal slip-up, but to advance a much larger argument. They use this moment as a metaphor, really, suggesting that the Democratic candidates inherently lack a clear vision and are just kind of stumbling over warmed-over policies that have already been failing for years.
Finally, Section 4, the California Dream Legacy, a philosophical clash.
The commentator noted Becerra's attempt to invoke the historic optimism of the state, right there on the debate stage. Becerra recalled this nostalgic story, trying to connect his personal family history to the deeply idealized vision of the Golden State. He talked about his parents arriving in California with only $12 in their pockets, yet still managing to live out the California dream. It's that classic, powerful mythos, right? A place where anyone, regardless of background, can arrive with almost nothing and build a prosperous, beautiful life. It was a textbook political appeal to emotion and hope, designed to remind voters of the state's foundational promise.
However, the broadcast heavily praised Sheriff Bianco's immediate and sharp counterargument. Bianco jumped in and asserted that this nostalgic prosperity Becerra was talking about was actually the direct result of past conservative leadership. He said the California dream they're talking about happened when you had a Republican governor in California. The commentator absolutely loved this moment. It was effectively the climax of the broadcast's entire framing. Bianco took Becerra's emotional appeal and completely flipped it on its head. The network used this exact rebuttal to drive home their ultimate thesis, that the cool vibe, the endless opportunity, and that true California dream of the past have entirely evaporated under current liberal leadership, replaced only by high taxes, endless regulations, and a profound loss of public trust.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. When you look at these fierce, intense arguments over housing costs, border and voting policies, and massive infrastructure spending, how much of this local debate is actually just a mirror of the whole country? The broadcast we analyzed used California as a cautionary tale, but the themes here,
deep frustration over government spending, the shifting Overton window on who gets to vote, and the very real, visceral crisis of addiction on our streets, they are playing out in cities nationwide. So are we just watching a localized debate, or are we actively watching the blueprint for the entire national political battle? Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.